Do not escalate the war in Ukraine any further. That's the stark warning that President-elect Donald Trump delivered to Russian President Vladimir Putin on November 7th, just a day after he won the US presidential election. And it's a sign to everybody in Ukraine that Trump is preparing to take Putin to task for his special military operation. Not only that, Trump also reminded Putin that the US maintains a strong military presence in Europe, suggesting that he'd be ready to use that presence if need be. However, that doesn't mean that Trump is going to be sending more weapons or even soldiers into Ukraine. Instead, the president-elect has a master plan. He's designed a pathway to peace that will not only lead to the end of the Ukraine war, but hit Putin where it hurts in more ways than one. If Trump's plan comes off, he could decimate the Russian economy for years to come, leaving the country a shadow of its former self as it tries to recover from the damage Putin's policies have caused. By pushing for peace, Trump is setting Putin up for a major fall. The question we'll answer in this video is simple: how? Trump's plan is filled with economic masterstrokes that will ultimately play out in Ukraine's favor, destroying Putin and the Russia he wants to create in the process. Does that sound difficult to believe? If so, remember that during Trump's first stint as US president, he took a bullish approach to dealing with Putin, even when others in Europe were trying to work alongside Russia's leader. A perfect example comes from his reaction to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. In July 2018, Reuters reported that Trump went on the attack in Europe, criticizing several European countries for cozying up to Russia. Germany was the main target of Trump's ire. He claimed that Germany's approval of a Baltic Sea gas pipeline with Russia would leave Germany a captive of Russia. How? Well, Trump argued that Putin was making Germany ever more dependent on its gas against the backdrop of Berlin dropping its defense spending to less than 1% of its GDP. So not only was Germany getting weaker militarily, feeding into Trump's issues with NATO, but it was putting the money it should have been spending on defense into Russian pockets. And Trump wasn't wrong. Germany's agreement with Russia saw it offer political support for an $11 billion pipeline named Nord Stream 2. As Trump pointed out in a conversation with former NATO head Jens Stoltenberg, "We're supposed to be guarding against Russia, and Germany goes out and pays billions and billions of dollars a year to Russia." Trump also claimed that Germany will have almost 70% of their country controlled by Russia with natural gas. While not entirely accurate in terms of pure control, Trump appeared to be right on the money when it comes to how much of Germany's natural gas supply would come from Russia as part of the deal. Trump was so against the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that he even signed a law imposing sanctions on any company that helped the Russian gas giant Gazprom to complete the pipeline. The BBC reported on this in December 2019, stating, "The US considers the project a security risk to Europe." Ironically, the European Union, or EU, joined Russia in strongly condemning Trump's decision. Eventually, the US reached an agreement on the pipeline with Germany and Russia in July 2021, after Trump had left office. Less than a year later, Putin invaded Ukraine. Trump's opposition to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline made sense. He foresaw what that deal meant for Europe in terms of allowing Russia to control so much of its natural gas supply. And sure enough, much of Europe was soon racked by higher gas and electricity bills as Putin's Ukraine invasion saw the EU have to do an embarrassing about-face on its Putin policies. Electricity and natural gas prices shot up from 2021 onward. Gas went from a taxed rate of around 14 cents per kilowatt hour to a peak of almost 25 cents in the second half of 2022. Electricity followed the same pattern. Its per kilowatt hour price rose from around 22 cents to between 30 and 31 cents in 2024. Trump saw all of that coming. He warned Europe about the dangers of getting into bed with Russia almost 4 years before Putin launched his special military operation. And Trump was also no stranger to directly opposing Russian operations outside the United States. Several months before he made his comments about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, Trump approved the use of force against Russian military contractors, a polite term for mercenary groups, in Syria. The battle that took place in February 2018 reportedly saw the US respond to a massive column of predominantly Russian pro-Syrian regime forces approaching an established US position with a wave of airstrikes. The Russian forces were crippled, with former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo claiming, "In Syria now, a handful of weeks ago, the Russians met their match. A couple hundred Russians were killed." The message here is clear. Trump opposed Putin during his first presidential term, and he's setting up to do the same all over again. We can see that from what he's done in the weeks leading up to him taking up the mantle of the US president in January 2025. For instance, September 2024 saw Trump meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Trump Tower. The The pair discussed both Ukraine's plans for the war as it moves into 2025 and what Trump intends to do to broker the peace he wants to achieve. Neither revealed much about the conversation that took place after they emerged from Trump Tower, but the mood was far more positive than many might have thought. Standing side by side with Trump, Zelensky claimed the two shared a common view that the war has to be stopped and Putin can't win, while explaining he intended to share his victory plan with Trump. After the meeting, Trump also seemed to be supportive of Zelensky's ambitions. The BBC reports that Trump said he learned a lot from the meeting. "We both want to see this end, and we both want to see a fair deal made," claimed Trump, while he noted that he thinks Zelensky and Putin want the war to come to an end. Granted, the meeting wasn't without its thornier side. In the run-up to the September 27th meeting of minds, ABC News reported on Zelensky expressing doubts over Trump's ability to end the war. "My feeling is that Trump doesn't really know how to stop the war, even if he might think he knows how," Zelensky said in an interview with The New Yorker. Trump responded on the campaign trail, criticizing Zelensky for making nasty little aspersions about him. With that contention in play, the positive outcome of the meeting between Zelensky and Trump wasn't guaranteed, but perhaps we were all missing something here. What Trump said on the campaign trail likely didn't reflect his true view of Zelensky. Regardless, once the two met, it became clear that they shared the goal of creating peace for Ukraine. We also saw an example of Trump's bullish approach to Putin in the call we mentioned in the video's introduction. The Kremlin claims that it never happened. It called reports of the call pure fiction. However, Trump's communication director Stephen Chung delivered a far cagier response, stating, "We do not comment on private calls between President Trump and other world leaders. Can we take this to mean the call actually happened?" Chung's words aren't a denial, suggesting that Trump did in fact call and make it clear to Putin where he really stands on the Ukraine crisis. Trump has already established himself as anti-Russia. So we come to a question. What's this master plan that will cause Russia's collapse that Trump is just waiting for his chance to execute? Trump has already told us. He wants to achieve peace between Ukraine and Russia as soon as possible. The great irony is that many don't realize that pushing Russia into this peace could force the start of an economic collapse that destroys the country from the inside. Therein may lie the brilliance of Trump's master plan. In a November 2024 article, the Wall Street Journal, or WSJ, noted that nobody really knows what Trump's peace plan contains. It even quoted a former Trump National Security Council aide who said, "Anyone, no matter how senior in Trump's circle, who claims to have a different view of more detailed window into his plans on Ukraine simply doesn't know what he or she is talking about." Still, the WSJ floated some ideas that are doing the rounds. One version of Trump's plan would see the creation of an 800-mile demilitarized zone running across almost the entirety of the war's front line. Ukraine would have to agree that it can't join NATO for at least 20 years for the plan to be enacted, but assuming it does, Trump would continue to send weapons to Ukraine to prevent future Russian attacks, while having European NATO-aligned troops patrolling the new demilitarized zone. The United States won't provide any of the training for these patrolling troops, or provide any additional support. As one Trump camp member put it, "We're not sending American men and women to uphold peace in Ukraine, and we're not going to pay for it. Get the Poles, Germans, British, and French to do it." A contentious way to put it, perhaps. But this quote reveals that this version of Trump's plan would both pause the Ukraine war and limit America's responsibility to Ukraine at a time when the conflict is escalating. Russia and Ukraine would be forced to fight through the European troops to get to one another. That isn't going to happen. Another suggested strategy is to cut Ukraine off from the weapons it's receiving from the United States until Zelensky agrees to sit down with Putin. Under this plan, Ukraine would still be able to fight for the territory it's lost inside Ukraine, only it would have to do so through negotiations rather than military action. We don't know if either of these plans is what Trump really has in mind, but the common thread is that both would force an end to the immediate hostilities between Russia and Ukraine. And though both plans seem like they're more favorable to Putin, particularly the first one involving freezing the current front lines, it's the peace that would result from either that would be the real killer blow to Putin. And why? Russia can no longer afford to end the war in Ukraine, and Trump knows it. Right now, a huge portion of Russia's economy is being driven by Putin's special military operation. All of this is happening while Putin and his cronies are still being impacted by the raft of sanctions the US and much of Europe put in place when Russia invaded Ukraine. In a February 2024 article for The Conversation, Lancaster University Management School economics professor Dr. Renaud Foucault laid out the precarious position in which Russia now finds itself. He noted that sanctions had helped to push Russia's GDP to around 7% lower than pre-war forecasts suggested it would be. The only reason it isn't even lower than that, and the reason why Russia hasn't collapsed economically already, is that war is proving to be very good business for Moscow. Dr. Foucault notes that Russia's economy was far from diverse even before the war. Natural resources, primarily oil and gas, were its main sources of income, and both have been affected by sanctions. At the 2-year point of the Ukraine war, the country found itself spending a staggering 40% of its governmental budget on the war. Total military spending was also believed to have hit around 10% of Russia's GDP for 2023. These are all bad signs for a Russia that hopes to be prosperous after the war with Ukraine ends. Ammunition production, military equipment, pay for soldiers, and compensation delivered to the families of wounded or dead troops all contribute to the 10% of GDP spending, Foucault says. In other words, Russia's weapons manufacturing industry is paying the wages of thousands of people inside the country. Those who are fighting rely on Russia's wartime economy to feed their families. And even with all of this, the war is slowly but surely draining Russia's reserves. Add a labor shortage into the mix, Foucault claims, and you have all of the ingredients of an economy that will collapse in on itself if the war ends. Now, what does Trump claim he's going to do as quickly as possible? End the Ukraine war. The peace he negotiates may not be favorable to Ukraine in the first instance. Zelensky may have to temporarily give up territory to Russia under Trump's 800-mile demilitarized zone plan, for instance, though he would keep territory in Kursk. But those short-term sacrifices would force a pause in the Russian war machine that would cause major problems. Thousands of soldiers would flood back home, many of them returning to a country that has no jobs outside of weapons manufacturing for them. As for those military-supporting jobs, they'd soon dry up as Russia no longer builds weapons at the rate it currently achieves. Russia may still look rich on the surface, particularly in terms of its resources, but Foucault believes that ending the war in Ukraine would expose how economically weak the country really is. Business Insider built on Foucault's argument in an article that it updated in September 2024. It pointed out that inflation was at a high of 7.4% at the time Foucault wrote his piece for The Conversation. It ended up going even higher. Reuters says that the Russian central bank has raised its inflation forecast to between 8 and 8.5% for the end of 2024, around double its 4% target. Interfax reports that Russia believes inflation will improve in 2025, but even then it's going above the original forecast of between 4 and 4.5%, up to between 4.5 and 5%. Foreign direct investment is also in free fall in Russia. The country recorded a decline of $8.7 billion in investment during the first 3 quarters of 2023, showing that overseas investors simply don't want to get into bed with Russia. Trump's peace plan will exacerbate all these issues. It gets even worse for Russia. In October 2024, both The Hill and the Atlantic Council published pieces suggesting that Russia's economy is already in danger of overheating to the point where it implodes upon itself. The Hill pointed out that Russia is already draining itself with the Ukraine war. Even though it's transitioned into a wartime economy, its nominal GDP, which is the total value of all goods and services a country produces, sits at just $2 trillion. That may sound like a massive figure until you realize that America's nominal GDP is $29 trillion. The Hill calls Putin bereft of money, claiming that his only options are to either plead to broader society to make concessions to his regime in return for the resources Russia provides, or to push on with the war. The latter is the Russian leader's most likely choice, because he knows that the former is unlikely. Economic collapse awaits if the war ends, which is where Trump's peace plan may be a masterstroke. The Atlantic Council piece paints a similarly grim picture for Putin. It claims Putin is stuck between a rock and a hard place with the war. Continuing it would mean more sanctions and a deeper dive into a military-industrial complex that's already engulfed Russia's economy. But ending the war could be even more damaging. Real incomes will drop for all but Russia's most elite, and Putin will be forced to deal with social instability at a time when he's weakened by a war that lasted for years beyond what he anticipated. He'd control a post-war Russia with a dwindling national welfare fund and an inflation situation that threatens to spiral out of control. So we come back to Trump's peace plan. Nobody knows the particulars of that plan, though theories abound. The one thing we do know is that Trump intends to put a stop to the war. That stop may require Ukraine to make sacrifices of territory in the short term, but it would also put an end to the only thing that's propping up Russia's economy at a time when the country is as isolated from the majority of the world as it's ever been. Trump demonstrated in his first presidential stint that he's willing to bite back at Putin while criticizing those who do business with Russia's leader. Perhaps his big plan for his second term is to plunge Russia into economic chaos by taking away the war that's keeping the country running. The slow burn collapse of Putin's regime may follow as social unrest forces Russia's leader to reconsider his geopolitical ambitions. And if Trump maintains America's sanctions, along with enforcing tariffs on any products Russia attempts to export to the US, Russia's economic situation would become even more dire. Russia's economy needs the Ukraine war. Donald Trump wants to end that war as soon as possible. If he's successful, we may be watching the collapse of Putin's ambitions play out at the hands of a man who so many feel is beholden to Russia. But what do you think about Trump's peace plans? Would the end of the Ukraine war truly shatter Russia's economy? Will Trump's plan really lead to an end of the Ukraine war within 24 hours? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.